The mud swamp of Varrock 3 stretched before the assembled cadets like a living wound in the planet's surface, an expanse of dark, heaving sludge that breathed with slow, bubbling exhalations. Every few seconds the surface shifted, as if something enormous moved beneath it, and the sickening sound of sucking mud rolled across the clearing. For generations, the swamp had been regarded as one of the most unforgiving terrains in the Academy's entire training system, a place where physics bent into something inconvenient, unpredictable, and merciless. The instructors stood on a narrow strip of dry soil that served as the official starting line, and the cadets remained behind it, each staring into the malice of the swamp with a mix of dread and disbelief. Elena Ward, the only human among them, observed in silence, her breath steady, her posture relaxed, yet attentive. The instructors, 3 stern veterans of planetary survival operations, began their briefing with the usual ceremony. The lead instructor, an older member of the insectoid Zaret species, extended his glinting forelimbs and carved a deep scratch into the soil with a single motion. His voice vibrated like a low drone as he declared the rule everyone already knew from the written test. No flying, no artificial supports, no floating devices, and no technology of any kind. The objective was simple to describe and nearly impossible to achieve: cross the swamp by foot, using only what the environment offered. The instructor emphasized that the mud was not merely wet soil, but a hyper-reactive organic mixture, capable of sensing weight distribution and collapsing into sudden pockets of liquefaction that swallowed anything heavier than a small lizard within seconds. No cadet in Academy history had succeeded. As soon as the instructor finished speaking, tension rippled across the group. One of the reptilian cadets, a tall and muscular trainee named Korash, stomped a heavy foot on the ground and let out a snort of frustration. He had been told stories of this trial by upper-year students who had failed it repeatedly. He believed himself stronger than most, convinced that brute power could overcome what others feared. He cracked his knuckles, narrowed his amber eyes, and prepared to charge forward as if speed might somehow outsmart the swamp. To his left, a delicate avian cadet folded her wings tightly against her back, trembling with visible anxiety. She was forbidden from flying across, and without her wings, she felt only half herself, vulnerable and grounded in a way that left her nearly breathless. Elena stood slightly apart from the others, her gaze fixed not on the instructors, but on the swamp's surface. She noticed how the mud's texture was uneven, forming ridges, ripples, and darker pools. She watched how a large bubble formed near the center, rose like a blister, and burst with a thick puff of steam. She focused on the rhythm of those movements, the strange consistency of the surface, and the faint outlines of tree roots weaving into the edges like skeletal fingers reaching inward. She did not speak, did not move, and did not reveal her thoughts. Her stillness contrasted sharply with the shifting nervousness around her. The instructor marked the countdown, a slow and steady descent from 10 to 1. The reptiles tensed. The avians swallowed dryly. The arachnids flexed their limbs, ready to leap. The small amphibians crouched low, hoping their lighter bodies might give them a greater chance. Elena inhaled once, long and calm. She had studied environments like this before. Not this swamp specifically, but similar unstable terrains on Earth and off-world. She knew that assuming the ground was passive was a mistake. This swamp was alive with chemical reactions, pressure shifts, and microstructures that collapsed without warning. The swamp did not behave with malice, but it behaved with consistency, and consistency could be understood. The moment the instructor shouted the start command, Korash bolted forward. His heavy stride created deep impact points in the soil, and by the time he reached the first 3 meters of swamp edge, the mud had sensed the force of his weight. Before he could take a second step into the surface, the ground liquefied beneath him, opening into a maw of thick, churning mud. He roared in alarm as he sank to his waist. 2 assistants hurled a retrieval line, pulled him out with visible effort, and dragged him back to safety. Karash coughed sludge from his mouth, humiliated and furious. The avian cadet tried next, attempting a sequence of delicate, rapid steps, believing that minimal ground contact would reduce the swamp's response. For 2 breathtaking seconds, she almost seemed to skim the surface, until one step placed her foot above a darker patch. The ground collapsed instantly. Her legs plunged in, and her cry echoed across the clearing before the assistants retrieved her just as quickly. The amphibian cadets followed, hoping their lighter forms might fare better, but the swamp cared little for their optimism. Every attempt ended the same way: sinking, flailing, panicked gasps, and swift rescue. Within minutes, the instructors looked as though they had seen this failure 1,000 times, because they had. Elena noticed how none of the cadets had looked closely before acting. Every one of them had assumed the swamp was uniform. Every one of them had believed speed, agility, or luck would save them. She waited, not with hesitation, but with deliberate patience. She was accustomed to watching first, acting second. She had been raised in environments where rushing forward without understanding the system meant inviting injury, disaster, or worse. While the others stepped aside, soaked in mud and disappointment, Elena stepped toward the edge and crouched low. The instructors exchanged glances, clearly expecting another failed attempt. One of them even began preparing a retrieval line in advance. Elena did not acknowledge them. She scooped a small portion of the mud with her fingers and rolled it gently. It clung stubbornly, stretching like glue and snapping like elastic. She studied the underlayer beneath the surface film, noticing tiny threads of fibrous plant matter embedded within. She looked up at the massive trees surrounding the swamp, their roots exposed in some places, wrapping into the mud like veins. She tested the nearest root with her hand. It was surprisingly firm. She pulled gently, then more firmly, and it flexed, but did not break. It vibrated slightly, as if part of a larger interlinked system beneath the swamp. She realized the roots were not random. They formed a living network feeding off the swamp's nutrients. That network was stronger than it looked, and possibly anchored deep enough to bear weight. Elena stood slowly, brushing mud from her fingers. She did not smile, but her eyes sharpened with focus. She had no intention of rushing into the swamp as Korash had done. She understood now that the swamp did not reject everything. It rejected unsupported mass. It rejected pressure applied in the wrong way. It rejected ignorance. The instructors announced that the first phase of attempts was complete and that the cadets could reassess their strategies before making a second attempt. Elena remained at the edge, analyzing the patterns of bubbles, the intervals of shifting pockets, and the subtle tug of the root system beneath the mud. She felt the first forming outline of an idea, not a plan to outrun the swamp or to defy it, but a plan to cooperate with what already existed in the environment. The swamp was not an enemy. It was a puzzle, and she intended to solve it. Elena remained near the swamp's trembling edge long after the instructors dismissed the other cadets to recover from their humiliating first attempts. Mud still clung to the boots of the reptilian trainee, and the avian cadet sat hunched on a fallen log, wiping violet streaks from her legs with shaking hands. No one approached Elena or paid attention to what she was doing. Most of the cadets assumed that the second round of attempts would end the same way as the first, and none of them believed that careful observation mattered in a place where the ground behaved like a living trap. Elena, however, understood that nothing in nature acted without a set of rules, even when those rules were buried beneath layers of chaos and unpredictability. She stepped closer to the roots along the edge and pressed her palm against one of the thicker ones. It pulsed faintly with the movement of liquid nutrients within. She studied how that pulse reacted when the swamp shifted nearby. Each time the mud exhaled a large bubble, the root tightened, almost imperceptibly, as if contracting in response to pressure changes deep underground. That tightening was subtle, but it was consistent. It meant the roots were linked to a network sensitive to tension. Elena reasoned that if the root system reacted this way to decomposing gas within the swamp, then it must also react to weight, anchoring itself to protect its own structural integrity. If she could align her movements with that natural rhythm, she might be able to build something stable. She crouched again and traced lines in the mud, marking where the roots were most exposed. She dug with her hands, pulling away loose sludge until she uncovered a thicker bundled section. It was covered in fine fibers, almost like hairs, which extended upward toward the trees. Elena tugged gently and felt the fibers tighten around her fingers. The entire structure behaved like a woven web of plant matter, but unlike a web, it did not snap or tear. It flexed, it adjusted, it learned the pressure being applied to it. Behind her, one of the instructors observed silently. He was a member of the plated core species, his armored body reflecting the sparse sunlight filtering through the swamp's thin mist. He folded his arms and watched Elena's quiet examination with growing interest. His face remained unreadable, but his stance shifted slightly, betraying curiosity. Elena sensed his gaze but did not acknowledge it. She did not seek approval or reassurance from any instructor. She needed clarity, not praise. She moved farther along the edge, stepping lightly from one exposed root to the next, careful not to disturb the fragile balance. She paused every few feet to test the stability of the roots beneath her. Some held firm, some sagged. Others sank almost immediately, revealing pockets of mud beneath them that pulsed with unseen activity. She noted each of these reactions carefully, memorizing the rhythm of the swamp as if she were studying the breathing pattern of a dangerous animal. When she reached a cluster of young saplings near the waterline, she noticed something new. Thin vines wrapped around the roots in spiraling layers, tightening at certain points and loosening at others. She pulled one gently and discovered it was flexible but incredibly strong. She stretched it between her hands, feeling the resistance. It reminded her of braided cords she had used during field survival training. The texture was rough but workable, and the vine did not tear even when she applied her full strength. She looked back across the swamp, imagining lines of these vines crossing the unstable surface. She imagined weaving the roots together, binding them into a single supportive path. She imagined the way the swamp reacted to weight, and she wondered whether she could distribute her own weight in a way that the swamp could not interpret as a threat. She had no tools, no technology, and no artificial supports, but nature provided everything she needed if she understood the patterns correctly. One of the amphibian cadets approached from behind, limping slightly from his earlier fall into the mud. He hovered at a distance, unsure whether to speak. He watched Elena with a mixture of skepticism and admiration. Finally, he cleared his throat and asked her what she was looking for. Elena did not turn, and her voice remained steady as she answered that she was trying to understand why the swamp sank faster in some places than others. The cadet shrugged and said that the swamp simply behaved as it pleased, unpredictable and irrational. Elena listened without reacting. She knew the cadet was wrong, but she did not correct him. She had no interest in convincing anyone. She needed time, and she needed quiet. When the cadet left, Elena continued her work. She searched for more vines, identifying which ones were strongest and which ones were hollow or fragile. She discovered that the younger vines clung tightly to the older roots, forming natural bindings. The vines grew in spirals, always clockwise, never counterclockwise. That pattern mattered. Patterns always mattered. She tested one spiral, loosening it from the root and rewrapping it in the opposite direction. When she stepped onto it, the vine loosened immediately, and the entire structure shuddered. That taught her something critical. The root system strengthened itself through tension created by natural spiraling growth. If she worked against that direction, the swamp's structure would collapse. But if she worked with it... She looked up at the canopy above her. The large trees towered over the swamp, their branches thick and intertwined with one another. She realized the swamp was not just a patch of hostile terrain. It was the lower layer of a massive forest ecosystem where everything depended on everything else. The roots fed the trees, the vines stabilized the roots, and the mud fed the roots with nutrients and microorganisms. The whole system behaved like a single living organism. If she connected the structures correctly, the swamp might support more weight than anyone expected. She moved back toward the starting line and sat down, her boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. She closed her eyes and imagined the structure beneath the swamp. She pictured the roots running in long, twisted lines beneath the mud, branching like neural pathways. She pictured the vines pulling those pathways together, forming braids of living material. She pictured herself stepping on those braids, distributing her weight across the system, rather than forcing it onto a single unstable point. She opened her eyes and smiled faintly, not with confidence, but with recognition. She understood now what the swamp demanded. It was not a challenge of speed or strength. It was a challenge of awareness, patience, and respect for the environment. The cadets who had rushed forward had failed because they assumed the swamp was an obstacle. Elena saw it differently. The swamp was a collaborator, waiting to be understood. The instructors announced that the second round of attempts would begin soon, and Elena rose to her feet. She brushed the damp soil from her hands, looked once more at the network of roots at the swamp's edge, and prepared herself. She knew what she needed to do next. She also knew that the others would not understand until she showed them. She was ready to begin. Elena stepped closer to the dense tangle of roots at the swamp's border, feeling the weight of the instructor's attention settling on her, though none of them spoke. She sensed curiosity behind their silence, but she remained focused on the roots beneath her feet. The swamp exhaled a long, wet breath, causing ripples to shimmer across the surface, but Elena no longer flinched at the sound. She had spent enough time studying the swamp's behavior to understand its rhythm. She knew now that the swamp was not unpredictable. It was simply reactive, and every reaction left behind a trace that she could observe, interpret, and use. She knelt beside a thick root that curved out of the soil like the spine of a buried creature. Its bark was firm, textured with ridges that twisted in a clockwise pattern. She wrapped both hands around it, testing for elasticity. The root resisted her pull at first, then flexed slightly, as if acknowledging her presence. She tugged again, this time applying pressure in the same direction as the root's natural twist, and she watched how the fibers tightened, pulling inward rather than fraying outward. She felt a deep satisfaction settle in her chest. This root was part of a network strong enough to hold its own against the swamp's turbulent surface. If she could extend that strength outward, even a single step into the swamp could become viable. She scanned the ground around her, identifying loose vines scattered around the base of the trees. Some vines hung low, brushing against the mud, while others curled upward like green serpents reaching for sunlight. She picked up one of the thicker vines and tested it between her hands. It resisted her pull, bending like tempered metal rather than brittle plant matter. She studied its surface and noticed the same spiral pattern she had seen in the roots. That pattern was key. It gave the vine its strength. She turned the vine over in her hands, pressing her fingers into the grooves to assess its texture. It felt alive, pulsing faintly in response to her touch. She knew she could work with it. She moved along the edge until she found a point where several roots intersected. The natural network created a platform that rose slightly above the mud, forming a stable surface where she could stand without sinking. She placed her weight carefully onto it, adjusting her balance to match the gentle sway of the roots beneath her. The roots flexed, but held firm. Elena crouched again and tested the spacing between them. If she aligned these roots with the vines in a consistent direction, she could create a braid strong enough to support her footstep. One of the instructors stepped closer, his heavy boots sinking slightly into the wet soil. Elena sensed his presence but did not look up. She had no interest in explaining her thought process until she had something tangible to show. Instead, she selected 3 vines with similar thickness and laid them across 2 exposed roots, pressing them down until they held their position. She pulled the ends tight, ensuring that the vines wrapped in the same spiral direction as the roots. The network responded with a low vibration, adjusting its tension in a way that reassured her. She tightened the vines further, securing them until they formed a lattice that connected two separate clusters of roots into a single support. When she stood on the makeshift platform, she felt the structure shift, but it did not collapse. Instead, it distributed her weight along the roots, making the entire segment flex slightly under her, like a living bridge adjusting to its load. She stepped off and tested the platform again by pressing her hand against it. The structure held. It was not yet strong enough to bear a full step into the swamp, but it was the first sign that a walkway might be possible. Elena moved deeper along the root line and found another cluster of vines. She gathered them carefully, sorting the strong vines from the weak ones. She wound a thick vine around three smaller ones, twisting them into a braided cord that felt durable in her hands. She moved back to her test platform, added the new braid, and secured it by threading it through gaps between the roots. The roots responded with another vibration, as if acknowledging the added structure. Elena pressed her foot onto the braid with tentative force. This time the structure barely moved. A soft grunt reached her ears, and she turned to see the reptilian cadet, Korash, watching her with narrowed eyes. His earlier confidence had been bruised by his failure, and now he observed her actions with suspicion. He asked her what she hoped to accomplish by binding plants together like primitive tools. Elena answered quietly that she was testing how the root system responded to reinforcement. Korash scoffed and muttered that the swamp punished anyone who stepped into it, regardless of roots or vines. Elena did not argue. She simply returned to her task. She moved forward, selecting a new stretch of roots to test. She stepped lightly onto one, allowing half of her weight to settle onto the network. The roots sank slightly, responding to the pressure, but did not collapse. She withdrew her foot, then reinforced the root with two vines, pulling them tight in the same spiral direction. She anchored one end of the vine to a thicker root behind her, then looped the other end around a sapling trunk, creating a tension line that acted like a support beam. When she stepped onto the root again, it sagged less. The instructors exchanged looks, and one of the amphibian cadets stopped rubbing dried mud from his arms to watch her more closely. Elena moved deliberately, never rushing a decision, never assuming the structure would behave the same way twice. She tested every part of the network, creating small platforms, adjusting them, reinforcing weaknesses, and learning how each layer interacted with the next. The swamp continued to shift, but she adapted with it, finding stability in its movement rather than fighting against it. After nearly half an hour of adjustments, she created a platform large enough to stand on with both feet. She stepped onto it cautiously, centering her weight. The roots flexed beneath her, but the vines redistributed the tension, anchoring the platform to the stronger clusters behind her. She shifted her balance from left to right, testing how the structure reacted to uneven force. It held. She exhaled slowly, feeling a surge of confidence. The walkway was possible. She could build it, but she needed to extend the platform farther, reaching deeper into the swamp. She knew the swamp's surface would resist her more aggressively the farther she moved from the anchored edge. She also knew the vines might have limits, and she would have to discover those limits before committing to the next step. She moved to the farthest point of her platform and crouched again. She placed her hand lightly on the mud, feeling its temperature and texture. The mud quivered, reacting to her presence. She removed her hand slowly, careful not to apply unnecessary pressure. She looked at the vines draped across the roots and the shapes of the intertwined fibers beneath her feet. She began selecting the next set of vines, choosing only the strongest and thickest ones, ignoring the rest. She started to weave the vines together, forming a thicker rope. She pulled the rope tight, using her full strength to bind the natural fibers into a dense, resilient strand. Her arms burned from the effort, but she continued until the rope felt as firm as any manufactured cord she had used in her training. She threaded one end of the rope through the roots beneath her and anchored the other end to a tree trunk behind her. She pulled the rope taut, testing its resilience, and the roots vibrated in response. Satisfied, she stepped onto her expanded platform. It flexed slightly under her weight, but the tension lines held firm. She took one careful step forward, one small step into the swamp's domain. The mud quivered beneath her, but the roots beneath the surface did not collapse. She withdrew her foot, knowing she was not yet ready to commit fully. She had proven her idea. She had proven that the swamp could support her if she respected its structure. The walkway was no longer an abstract possibility. It was something she could build, piece by piece, root by root, using nothing but what the swamp already offered. She rose to her full height, wiped the mud from her hands, and prepared to begin building the first true segment of her path across the sinking grounds. Elena moved to the edge of the platform she had built and let her eyes trace the murky expanse ahead. The swamp's surface heaved in slow, steady motions, as if breathing beneath its thick blanket of mud. Nothing about it appeared welcoming, yet she no longer felt hesitation. She had tested enough of the swamp's responses to understand how it behaved under tension, pressure, and movement. Now she needed to shift from testing to committing. The time for cautious observation had passed. She had to transform her small, stable perch into something that stretched outward, something that could carry her weight across an environment designed to reject every species that touched it. She gathered the nearest vines, selecting those with the strongest spirals and thickest cores. She tugged each one gently to ensure it had the flexibility to withstand bending without snapping. Once she had enough, she laid them across the front edge of her existing platform, creating a cluster of overlapping strands. She pushed them into gaps between the roots, threading them in a pattern she had already memorized. She pulled each vine in the direction of its natural spiral, letting the fibers tighten naturally instead of forcing them into an unnatural shape. The moment she anchored the first vine, the roots beneath her feet responded with a faint vibration. She paused, listening to the subtle shift, then pressed her hand onto the roots to feel the movement. The vibration traveled outward, spreading along the structure in a gentle wave. She recognized the sensation. The swamp's root network was adjusting itself around the new tension, accepting the added binding as part of its system. She felt a quiet thrill inside her chest. She was no longer working against the swamp. She was working with it. She anchored the remaining vines one after another, weaving them in a tight lattice that stretched forward. The structure extended only half a meter beyond her platform, but it was her first true step into the swamp's territory. She placed her weight onto the lattice with extreme caution. The vines flexed beneath her foot, but the roots beneath them tightened, responding to the new distribution of weight. She withdrew her foot, satisfied but still wary. The structure would need reinforcement before she dared to place her full weight on it. She pulled another thick vine from the nearest sapling and threaded it through the outermost edge of the lattice. She tied it around a thicker root behind her, creating an additional tension line that acted like a support beam. When she tugged on the line, the entire front section tightened. She stepped on the lattice again, this time placing more weight. The vines dipped but did not collapse. She moved her weight backward, stepped off, and reinforced the entire section one more time. Only then did she trust it enough to continue extending the walkway. One of the instructors stepped closer, deliberately keeping quiet so she could concentrate. His presence was steady but unobtrusive. Elena sensed a shift in the atmosphere behind her, as if the rest of the cadets had stopped whatever they were doing and were now watching her every movement. She did not turn around. She did not want to lose the clarity she had built in her mind. She reached for more vines, determined to connect the next segment before the swamp shifted too much. She moved to the farthest point of her extended platform and crouched low, pressing her fingers into the mud to test the consistency. The mud shuddered against her skin, reacting instantly. She pulled her hand back and wiped it on her trousers, noting the increased agitation. The swamp disliked extended pressure in one place. She needed to move quickly but carefully. She began weaving the next set of vines, braiding them into a tight rope that would serve as both a handle and a load-bearing support. She looped the rope through the newly formed lattice and pulled with all her strength. The roots beneath her vibrated again, absorbing the tension. She tied the rope to another tree trunk behind her, creating a tension arc that stretched across the walkway. She stepped onto the new section, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. The walkway flexed again, but each flex triggered a corresponding adjustment beneath the surface. She located a thin root poking through the mud 2 steps ahead, grabbed it carefully, and tested its stability. It held firm, meaning it could serve as the next anchor point. She used her knife, not to cut, but to pry mud away from the base of the root, revealing more of the structure beneath. She threaded a vine through it, securing it to the walkway. She moved forward again, this time placing nearly her entire weight on the structure. The vines dipped slightly, but the roots tightened immediately, distributing the force. She took another step. The mud quivered, threatening to liquefy, but the walkway held. Elena felt her pulse quicken. She was no longer at the swamp's edge. She was 2 full steps into the territory where every previous attempt had ended in failure. She extended the walkway further, weaving new segments with increasing speed. Each time she reached forward, she found another root beneath the mud. She felt the network react to her presence, flexing beneath her feet as if guiding her toward stronger points. It was not a conscious guide, she knew that, but it behaved like a living system responding to a partner rather than rejecting an intruder. She pushed farther, weaving, anchoring, and adjusting. Her arms burned from the constant pulling and tightening of vines, but she refused to stop. She could no longer hear the instructors behind her. All she heard was the swamp's rhythm, the sigh of escaping gas, the soft slosh of shifting mud, and the faint hum of the root network beneath her. She tuned into that rhythm, matching her movements to it. Each step forward became a dance between her weight and the swamp's reaction. At one point, the root she reached for sagged unexpectedly. The mud beneath her hissed, and the surface began to liquefy. She pulled back immediately, anchoring her weight onto the previous section of the walkway. She felt the vines tighten behind her, supporting her retreat. She took a breath to steady herself, then located another root slightly to the left. She tested it, found it firm, and redirected her walkway in that direction. She learned in that moment that the swamp had weak spots, but those weak spots could be avoided if she paid attention. She continued weaving until her walkway stretched several meters from the swamp's edge. She paused to look back, surprised by how far she had come. The cadets stood silently, their earlier doubts replaced by awe. The instructors remained motionless, though shock flashed across the face of the core instructor who had watched her earlier tests. Elena turned back toward the swamp, wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead, and prepared to extend the walkway even farther. She felt the structure beneath her grow stronger with each new vine she added. The swamp no longer felt like an adversary. It felt like a complex, breathing environment that she was beginning to understand intimately. She took another step forward and felt the walkway hold with a steady firmness that filled her with confidence. She no longer wondered whether she could cross the swamp. She wondered only how soon she would reach the other side. The impossible was no longer distant. It was taking shape beneath her feet, root by root, vine by vine. Elena paused halfway across the swamp as the living walkway beneath her shifted in a slow undulation. The roots tightened, and the vines that she had woven into supportive arcs pulsed in response to the newly applied tension. She stood still for a moment, letting the structure settle beneath her weight. She had extended the walkway farther than she had dared to imagine at the start of the trial, yet she sensed that the most delicate part of the crossing still lay ahead. The swamp grew less predictable the deeper she went, and the roots more sparse. She breathed slowly, allowing her focus to sharpen again. She lowered herself into a crouch and pressed her fingertips gently into the mud ahead. The surface trembled in reply, sending a ripple across the swamp. She felt the shift travel through the walkway, signaling that the ground in front of her was unstable. That instability did not discourage her. It only told her that she needed to anchor the next section with more intention. She studied the slight discoloration in the mud, recognizing it as a sign of weaker pockets. To her right, the mud held a firmer shade and moved with more rhythm than chaos. She shifted her route toward that direction. She located a submerged root by sweeping her hand across the surface until her fingers brushed against the coarse texture of bark. She cleared the mud around it with careful strokes, revealing a long, thick extension of the root network. It was partially buried, but she could use it as a stable anchor. She looped a thick vine around it, tightening the spiral in the direction of the root's natural twist. She pulled the vine toward her walkway, threading it through the existing structure. As she pulled, the entire walkway adjusted with a soft creak, drawing strength from the new anchor. She tested the tension line by leaning forward and placing a fraction of her weight on the reinforced root. The swamp reacted with a gentle quiver, not a violent collapse. That meant she could extend the walkway another meter in that direction. She worked swiftly, weaving new vines into the existing lattice, forming a denser braid than before. Her fingers moved confidently, guided by instinct and understanding she had gained through every previous adjustment. She stretched the new segment across the mud, aligning it with the tension lines that radiated backward across the walkway. She stepped onto the freshly completed section with measured caution. The roots beneath her vibrated again, but this time the vibration felt almost supportive, like the forest itself was helping her maintain balance. She took another step and felt the vines tighten beneath her boot, redistributing her weight along the length of the walkway. The mud beneath her remained still. She allowed her weight to settle fully onto the new segment. It held. Behind her, the cadets and instructors remained silent. She sensed the heavy stillness that carried through the swamp, but she did not turn. She could not afford distraction. She continued weaving forward, finding new routes, fortifying weak points, and adjusting the walkway where necessary. Every few meters she paused to test the mud's reaction before proceeding. Each time she chose the route that resonated with the swamp's underlying structure, avoiding weak pockets by reading subtle shifts that only someone who had observed so closely could truly interpret. She moved deeper still, and the walkway extended farther, weaving through the swamp like a living tapestry born of patience and understanding. Her muscles burned from the constant pulling, tightening, and balancing, but she ignored the fatigue. She focused on the next route, the next vine, the next segment that would bring her closer to the far side. The walkway grew sturdier as she progressed, supported by the root network that spanned beneath the swamp like an enormous underground web. At one point, the walkway dipped sharply under her weight, sinking several centimeters into the mud. A surge of alarm shot through her, but she immediately shifted her balance to the previous section, relieving pressure on the weak spot. She crouched, pressed her hand into the vines, and felt for the point of strain. She located the failing section near the left anchor. She pulled another vine from a cluster nearby, threaded it through the tension line, and pulled it tight with all her strength. The walkway lifted slightly, regaining its shape. She reinforced it with 2 additional vines before moving forward again. The structure steadied beneath her boots, and the swamp fell silent once more. Gradually, the mist ahead began to thin, revealing a faint outline of solid ground on the far bank. The sight tightened her chest with a mixture of relief and renewed determination. She could not let the excitement rush her. She forced herself to maintain the same slow, methodical pace she had used from the beginning. She extended the walkway one careful segment at a time, ensuring every new piece could bear her full weight before she stepped onto it. The roots grew thicker again as she neared the far edge. She took advantage of the increased stability, threading her vines through the dense network and tightening her structure with greater confidence. The walkway behind her no longer sagged or hissed under her weight. Instead, it moved with a steady rhythm, proof of the harmony she had created between her construction and the swamp's natural design. She reached the last stretch of mud separating her from solid ground. The distance was short enough for a jump, but she chose not to leap. A jump risked collapse or an unexpected reaction from the swamp. Instead, she reinforced the final segment of the walkway, threading 3 vines in parallel, then braiding them into a thick rope that she tightened until her arms trembled. When the structure held firm under her hand, she stepped forward onto the last cluster of roots. The mud quivered weakly, unable to destabilize the reinforced section. She reached out and touched solid earth with the tips of her fingers. A warm surge of triumph filled her chest. She took one final step, placing her entire boot onto the ground beyond the swamp. The walkway behind her tightened as if acknowledging the end of her journey. She turned slowly, looking back across the distance she had traversed. The living walkway stretched across the swamp in a winding line of woven roots and vines, each segment anchored with intention and care. It looked almost natural, as if it had grown there rather than been crafted by her hands. The cadets on the far bank stared in stunned silence, their expressions frozen in disbelief. The instructors stood motionless as well, though one of them finally placed a hand over his mouth, unable to hide his astonishment. Elena breathed deeply, letting the smell of earth and forest fill her lungs. She felt a profound sense of connection to the environment she had just worked with. She had not conquered the swamp. She had understood it. She had respected its reactions, learned its patterns, and built something in harmony with its nature. That understanding, more than the crossing itself, felt like the true achievement. The lead instructor stepped forward, his posture firm, but his voice thick with genuine reverence. He announced that Elena Ward had accomplished what no cadet in the Academy's history had ever achieved. She had crossed the mud swamp trial using only the environment, without violating a single rule. This trial had defeated generations of students from dozens of species, yet she had succeeded through observation, patience, and adaptation. She listened quietly, her breathing still steady, her mind replaying every moment of the crossing. She felt no need to celebrate loudly. The walkway behind her was celebration enough. It stood as proof that even the most impossible challenges could be solved through understanding rather than force. She stepped back onto the ground fully, her boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. As the instructors approached her, she glanced once more at the walkway. It remained intact, gently flexing as if alive with its own breath. She knew it would eventually sink back into the swamp, reclaimed by the environment that had allowed her to build it. She felt no disappointment at that thought. The walkway had served its purpose, and its memory would endure long after the vines and roots dissolved into the mud. With the swamp behind her, Elena lifted her chin and walked toward the waiting instructors. She had crossed the uncrossable, and she had